He expected a black-edged letter announcing her death before the first frost. He did not expect to find her alive, ruling his ruined estate like a queen, magnificent in her defiance. He had purchased a quiet death, a solution to a problem, and left her in a tomb to expire with grace. He returned to find the tomb fiercely alive and completely whole, and the woman he had condemned to silence had found her voice in the heart of its stones, a voice that now challenged his own. He had left a ghost and returned to find a fortress, with her as its unyielding castellan. The marriage took place in the vestry of a church that had long forgotten the scent of incense and the sound of prayer. It smelled only of damp stone and the slow, inevitable decay of forgotten things. Dust motes danced in the thin, gray light that filtered through a single grimy window, illuminating the scene with the detached curiosity of a mortician. There were no flowers. There was no music. There was only the dry rustle of paper and the low, monotonous drone of the solicitor reading the terms of the contract. It was a document of acquisition, not union, and every word hammered another nail into the coffin of Alara Vance's former life. Alara stood beside the man who was, in a matter of minutes, to become her husband. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood. His title was a cold, heavy weight in the small room, sucking the very air from her lungs. He was a pillar of stillness, his tall, broad-shouldered frame draped in a coat of severe black wool that seemed to absorb the meager light. He had not looked at her, not truly, since she had entered the room on the arm of her uncle. His gaze was fixed on some point beyond the solicitor's balding head, his profile as stark and unforgiving as a cliff face. She could feel the chill emanating from him, a palpable cold that had nothing to do with the damp seeping from the ancient walls. It was the deep, internal frost of a man hollowed out by duty, or perhaps by something far worse. Her uncle, Mr. Vance, stood a respectful distance away, his face a mask of strained piety that failed to conceal the triumphant gleam in his eyes. He had done it. He had rid himself of his inconvenient, penniless, and perpetually coughing niece by selling her to a duke who needed a wife for reasons no one dared to speak aloud. Alara was the final asset in a bankrupt estate, a last bit of ledger balancing. The cough that had plagued her for years, a persistent, rattling reminder of her frailty, was, ironically, part of her value. A sickly wife was a temporary wife. A temporary wife was a convenient solution. The Duke was purchasing a name for his line and the respectable appearance of matrimony, without the long-term inconvenience of a companion. Alara understood this with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass. "And do you, Alara Vance, take this man," the solicitor droned on, his voice as colorless as the day. Alara's own voice, when it came, was a thin, reedy thing, barely a whisper. "I do." The words felt like a betrayal of the girl she had once been, the one who read poetry and dreamed of a love as vast and wild as the sea. That girl was dead. This woman, this pale, slender creature with lucid, defiant eyes and ink stains on her fingers from a life spent in dusty libraries, was a survivor. And survivors made bargains. Alistair's response was a low, resonant rumble, the sound of stones grinding together deep underground. "I do." He did not turn. He did not offer his hand. His part in the transaction was complete. The solicitor gestured for them to sign the registry. Alistair's signature was a black, aggressive slash of ink. Alara's was precise, controlled, a small act of rebellion in its very neatness. She was not a scrawl. She was not an afterthought. She was Alara Vance, and for a few seconds more, that was still her name. Then she signed the second line, and her name was gone, absorbed into his. The Duke finally turned his head, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, meeting hers for the first time. There was no warmth in them, no curiosity, not even contempt. There was only a vast, chilling emptiness, the look of a man gazing upon a piece of furniture he had been forced to acquire. He saw her pallor, the faint blue veins at her temples, the way her worn dress hung from her slender frame. He saw the liability and the asset all at once. He saw a woman who looked as if a strong wind could shatter her. "It is done," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He addressed the solicitor, not her. "The funds will be transferred to Mr. Vance's account by day's end." Her uncle practically bowed, his relief a foul, cloying scent in the small space. "Your Grace is most generous." Most generous. Alistair's gaze flickered back to Alara, a brief, dismissive assessment. "A carriage is waiting. We depart for Blackwood immediately." He did not offer her his arm. He simply turned and walked out of the vestry, expecting her to follow like a well-trained hound. For a single, heartbeat-long moment, Alara stood frozen. She could run. She could scream. She could refuse. But the image of her uncle's face, smug and victorious, propelled her forward. The alternative was a slow, humiliating decline under his roof, a life of whispered insults and grudging charity. This, at least, was a different cage. Perhaps, she thought with a flicker of the gallows humor that had kept her sane, it would have a better view. She walked out of the church, leaving the scent of dust and decay behind, and stepped into the cold, damp air of her new life. The carriage was as black and severe as its owner, the ducal crest on the door a splash of tarnished silver against the gloom. The Duke was already inside, a dark shape in the shadows. He did not move to assist her. The footman, his face a study in professional indifference, lowered the steps. Alara gathered her thin cloak around her and climbed inside, the carriage door shutting behind her with a final, echoing clang of a vault. The journey to Blackwood was a study in silence. The carriage moved at a brisk, unrelenting pace, the rhythmic drumming of the horse's hooves and the creak of the leather suspension the only sounds in their shared space. They sat opposite each other, two strangers bound by a loveless contract, separated by a gulf wider than the plush velvet seat between them. Alistair did not speak. He stared out the window, his jaw tight, his thoughts clearly 1,000 miles away, in the smoke-filled drawing rooms of London or the blood-soaked fields of a war he had only recently left behind. His hands, resting on his knees, were large and scarred, the hands of a man who knew violence far more intimately than he would ever know the woman seated before him. Alara, for her part, retreated into herself. She watched the landscape change, the manicured fields and tidy villages of the south giving way to rougher, wilder country. The sky grew heavier, the clouds pressing down on the rolling hills. A fine mist began to bead on the windows, blurring the world outside into a watercolor wash of greens and grays. The cold from the morning seemed to have followed her, seeping into the carriage, into her very bones. She felt the familiar tickle in her chest, the precursor to a cough, and suppressed it with a force of will that made her eyes water. She would not show weakness. Not in front of him. It was the one piece of herself she could still control. She studied him from beneath her lashes, this Duke of Blackwood, her husband. He was handsome in a severe, brutal way. His dark hair was cut short, his features sharp and well-defined, but it was his eyes that held her. They were old eyes, ancient and exhausted, haunted by things she could not begin to imagine. He was a man drowning in his own title, his own history. She saw no room for a wife in that suffocating world, sick or well. He had acquired her for a purpose, and once that purpose was served, or once she expired, whichever came first, he would move on. She was a footnote in the grand, grim history of the Dukes of Blackwood. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, the carriage turned off the main road and onto a private track. The quality of the ride deteriorated immediately. The lane was deeply rutted, and skeletal branches from overgrown trees scraped against the roof of the carriage like skeletal fingers. A sense of profound neglect hung in the air, heavy and cloying. They passed a gatehouse with a collapsed roof and a pair of magnificent stone gates, one of which hung drunkenly from a single hinge, choked with ivy. This was his land. This was Blackwood. The carriage rattled on for what felt like another hour, plunging deeper into a forest that seemed to press in on all sides, dark and menacing. The mist had thickened into a proper drizzle, smearing the windows and shrouding the world in a damp, gray veil. The air inside the carriage grew thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. Alara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This was not a home. It was a grave. Finally, they broke through the trees, and the estate revealed itself. Blackwood Manor sat hunched on a slight rise, a sprawling Gothic monstrosity of dark gray stone that seemed to have been clawed from the very rock it stood upon. It was a place of jagged turrets and gaping, empty windows, a rotting tooth in the jaw of the desolate landscape. Most of the chimneys were cold and lifeless. Only one trickled a thin, pathetic stream of smoke into the weeping sky. The gardens were a tangled wilderness, statues covered in moss and black lichen, their stone faces screaming silently at the sky. The carriage pulled to a stop before a massive, oak front door studded with rusty iron. The silence that fell was profound, broken only by the sigh of the wind and the steady drip of rain from the eaves. No one came out to greet them. No lights appeared in the darkened windows. The house was as still and silent as a crypt. Alistair finally moved. He opened the carriage door himself and stepped out into the mud and rain, not even glancing back. A footman, who had ridden on the back, hurried to open her door and lower the steps. Alara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the monstrous house. It seemed to actively repel her, its stony facade radiating a malevolence that was almost personal. "Come." Alistair's voice cut through the drizzle, sharp and impatient. He stood by the front door, a dark silhouette against the darker stone, his shoulders hunched against the rain. Alara gathered her courage and descended from the carriage, her thin shoes sinking immediately into the soft mud of the driveway. The damp cold hit her with physical force, and the cough she had been suppressing all day finally broke free, a harsh, racking sound that echoed in the oppressive quiet. The Duke's head snapped around. His eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting moment, something flickered in their depths. Not concern, not pity, annoyance. She was already proving to be an inconvenience. The great oak door creaked open, and a woman stood framed in the shadowy doorway. She was tall and severe, dressed in black bombazine that seemed as old and rigid as the house itself. Her gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, and her expression was one of sour disapproval. This, Alara guessed, was the welcoming committee. "Mrs. Croft," Alistair said, his tone clipped. "This is the Duchess. See that she is settled in the East Wing." The woman, Mrs. Croft, dipped into a curtsy so shallow it was almost an insult. Her gaze swept over Alara, taking in the cheap dress, the pale face, and the lingering effects of the cough. It was a look of undisguised contempt. "The East Wing, Your Grace? It has not been aired in a decade. The East Wing," Alistair repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command that brooked no argument. He turned his attention back to Alara, his expression unreadable. He was done. He had delivered the package to its destination. He took a half-step toward her, and she flinched, expecting she did not know what. A touch? A word? He stopped, his gaze as remote as ever. "I have matters in London that require my attention. My return is uncertain." He did not say goodbye. He did not say he wished her well. He said nothing more at all. He simply turned, strode back to the waiting carriage without a backward glance, and climbed inside. The footman slammed the door, scrambled back to his perch, and with a crack of the whip, the carriage lurched forward, its wheels churning the mud. Alara stood alone in the rain, a pathetic, solitary figure before the looming mass of Blackwood Manor. She watched the carriage disappear back into the grasping, skeletal trees, its twin lamps swallowed by the encroaching darkness. He did not look back. He had brought her to this place of ruin and left her here to be swallowed by it. The unspoken instruction hung in the damp, cold air between them, as clear as any command. "Die quietly." The hostile housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, was still standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, a grim sentinel guarding the entrance to Alara's new prison. The rain plastered Alara's hair to her scalp and soaked through her thin cloak, and another cough tore through her, leaving her weak and trembling. She looked from the disappearing carriage to the dark, forbidding house, and then at the woman's stony face. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. A wave of despair, cold and vast as the sea, threatened to pull her under. But then, deep within her, a tiny, resilient spark of defiance flickered. She had survived her uncle. She had survived poverty. She would not be broken by a pile of stones and a sour-faced housekeeper. Lifting her chin, her eyes lucid and clear despite the chill shaking her body, Elara walked toward the door. She walked past Mrs. Croft without a word and stepped into the cavernous, echoing darkness of Blackwood Manor. The air inside was colder than it had been outside, thick with the smell of cold ash, mildew, and the dust of centuries. It smelled like a tomb. Her tomb. Mrs. Croft had her installed in a bedroom in the east wing, just as the Duke had commanded. The room was vast, cavernous, and possessed a chilling, sepulchral dampness that felt woven into the very fabric of the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something like wet, decaying paper. A gargantuan, four-poster bed, draped in rotting tapestries depicting a grim hunting scene, dominated the space. It was a bed designed for state, not for sleep, and it looked as inviting as a slab in a morgue. A single, grudging fire had been lit in the massive hearth, but it was a pathetic, smoky thing that produced more gloom than warmth, its feeble light only serving to accentuate the oppressive shadows that clung to the corners of the room. For 3 days, Elara lay in that monstrous bed, trapped between damp, musty sheets. The journey, the cold, and the profound shock of her abandonment had conspired against her, and the persistent tickle in her chest had erupted into a full-blown, feverish illness. She drifted in and out of a hallucinatory state, the grim figures in the tapestry seeming to writhe and mock her in the flickering firelight. Mrs. Croft attended her with a resentful diligence. A tray would appear with a bowl of thin, tasteless gruel and a jug of lukewarm water. The housekeeper would enter without knocking, her face a perpetual mask of grim satisfaction, as if Elara's sickness was merely confirming all her bleakest assumptions. "The damp in this wing is not for the delicate," Mrs. Croft stated on the second day, her voice flat as she placed the tray on a bedside table with a sharp click. It was not a statement of concern. It was an accusation. "You are weak. You do not belong here. You will fail." Elara, weak as she was, felt a familiar flare of anger. She pushed herself up on her elbows, the effort making her head spin. "Then perhaps," she rasped, her voice a ghost of its usual self, "a different room should have been prepared." A flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossed the housekeeper's face before it was replaced by the usual granite impassivity. His Grace was most specific. The East Wing. She smoothed her black apron, a gesture of finality. It is what he commanded. And with that, she was gone, leaving Elara to choke on her anger and the cold, damp air. By the 4th day, the fever began to recede, leaving her weak and hollowed out, but with a mind that was frighteningly clear. She lay in the oppressive gloom, listening to the rain lash against the window panes and the wind howl through the cracked eaves of the ancient house. This room, she realized, was not just a room. It was a weapon. It was designed to crush the spirit, to nurture illness, to hasten an end. The Duke had not just left her at Blackwood. He had placed her in its most lethal corner. He had been specific. The East Wing. He had known precisely what he was doing. A cold, white-hot clarity pierced through the fog of her illness. He expected her to die. Mrs. Croft expected her to die. The house itself seemed to expect her to die. They were all waiting for her to oblige them, to fade away quietly in this damp, forgotten room like a pressed flower crumbling to dust in a book. She would not. With a surge of adrenaline that felt more potent than any medicine, Elara threw back the heavy, damp blankets. Her feet hit the icy floorboards, the shock of it jolting through her body. She stood, swaying, her nightdress hanging from her skeletal frame. She looked at the pathetic fire, the untouched gruel, the monstrous bed. She was a dying woman in a dying room. No, she was a living woman, and she would start acting like one. Her gaze fell upon the bell, pulled beside the bed, a length of faded, frayed velvet. She strode to it and gave it a sharp, violent yank. The sound of a distant, jangling bell echoed somewhere deep in the bowels of the house, a frantic, demanding sound it had likely not made in years. She stood in the center of the room, her arms crossed against the cold, and waited. Minutes later, the door opened and Mrs. Croft appeared, her expression one of profound irritation. "Your Grace requires something?" The title was laced with sarcasm. "I do," Elara said, her voice stronger now, imbued with a new, steely resolve. "I require my things to be moved. Immediately." The housekeeper's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Moved where?" "Out of this room. Out of this wing," Elara declared. "Find me the smallest, driest, warmest room in the servants' quarters if you must. I will not spend another night in this mausoleum." Mrs. Croft's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "His Grace was most. His Grace is in London." Elara cut her off, her voice sharp as a shard of glass. "I am here, and I am the Duchess of this house. While I draw breath, it will be my commands that are followed, not the echoes of a man who is not present. Are you the head of this household, Mrs. Croft, or are you merely a mouthpiece for an absent master?" The direct challenge hung in the air, glittering and dangerous. The housekeeper's face hardened, her eyes like chips of flint. For a long moment, Elara thought the woman would refuse, would simply turn and walk away, leaving her to rot. The power in this house was old and entrenched, and Elara was a foreign body, an unwelcome interloper. But in her eyes, Mrs. Croft saw something she had not expected. Not the wilting fragility of a sickly girl, but the unbending iron of a woman who had been pushed to her absolute limit and had decided to push back. "Very well, Your Grace," Mrs. Croft said, the words clipped and frosty. "I will see to it." It was a victory, small but profound. It was the first stone she had dislodged from the wall of her prison. That afternoon, Elara was moved to a small, plain room in the central part of the house, a room once used by a governess. It was a fraction of the size of the state bedroom, but it had a small, efficient fireplace that drew properly, a window that looked out over a sheltered courtyard instead of the bleak, windswept moors, and it was blessedly, miraculously dry. She directed two bewildered-looking maids to strip the bed and air the mattress by the fire, to scrub the floors with vinegar and water, and to burn lavender and rosemary in the hearth to chase away the last of the musty smell. For the first time since her arrival, Elara breathed air that did not taste of decay. The next morning, she did not wait for a tray to be brought. She dressed in her sturdiest traveling gown and made her way down to the kitchens. It was a labyrinthine journey through cold, dusty corridors, past rooms shrouded in holland cloths like sleeping ghosts. The kitchens, when she found them, were a vast, cavernous space, but unlike the rest of the house, they were warm. A great fire roared in the range, and a small, plump cook and a scullery maid were staring at her, as if she were an apparition. "I am the Duchess," Elara announced, deciding that stating the obvious was the best way to assert a reality they had not yet accepted. "And I am hungry. What is for breakfast?" The cook, flustered, gestured to a pot of simmering porridge. "Porridge, Your Grace." "Good," Elara said. "Then I will have a bowl. Here." She pulled up a stool at the great wooden work table, ignoring their shocked expressions. She ate the plain, hot porridge with a spoon that did not match the bowl, and it was the most satisfying meal she had ever had. It tasted of survival. This became her new base of operations. From the warmth and life of the kitchens, she began her takeover. She started with the books. She demanded Mrs. Croft bring her the household ledgers. The housekeeper complied with a resentful slam of the heavy, leather-bound volumes on the kitchen table. For a week, Elara did nothing but study the accounts. Her father, before his debts had consumed him, had taught her how to manage a household. She had a mind for numbers, a sharp, practical intelligence that had been left to atrophy for years. Now it sprang to life. The Blackwood ledgers told a story of catastrophic neglect. Decades of it. Bills paid for wings of the house that were uninhabitable, wages for staff who no longer existed, orders for luxuries that never arrived or rotted in the larders. It was a ship with 100 leaks, slowly, inexorably sinking. Her first order was to stop the bleeding. She drew a thick, black line through 2/3 of the expenditures. "We will close the north and east wings completely," she announced to a stunned Mrs. Croft. "Board them up. There is no sense in heating rooms that are falling down. We will live in the central block and the west wing only." "But the staterooms," the housekeeper sputtered. "Are states of disrepair," Elara finished coolly. "We are not entertaining the king. We're trying to keep the rain out." She went through the staff lists, her pen hovering. Most were phantoms, their wages likely lining Mrs. Croft's pockets. She kept the cook, the scullery maid, 2 housemaids, and a name that appeared under the heading grounds, Silas. He was paid a pittance, far less than the non-existent butler. "Who is Silas?" she asked. "The groundsman," Mrs. Croft said with a sniff. "An old man. He tends what little he can." "I wish to see him," Elara said. Silas was a man who looked as though he had been grown from the very soil of Blackwood. He was gnarled and weathered, with kind, steady eyes and hands that were permanently stained with earth. He stood before her in the courtyard, his hat in his hands, his expression wary. "Silas," Elara began, foregoing any titles, "I have reviewed the books. You are in charge of the grounds." "What's left of them, miss?" he said, his voice a low, earthy rumble. He had not called her Your Grace. She found she did not mind. "Mostly I just try to keep the ivy from pulling the stones down and the driveway clear enough for a cart." "The kitchen gardens," she said, gesturing to a large, walled plot of land she had seen from her window. It was choked with weeds and brambles. "Are they salvageable?" A light came into the old man's eyes. "The soil's good, miss. Sour, but good. Hasn't been worked in 20 year, but the bones of it are there. Lord, the things we used to grow in there. Beans, potatoes, carrots enough to last 2 winters. Herbs, too." "Good," Elara said, a plan forming in her mind, a plan born of pure, desperate pragmatism. "We're going to bring it back. We will grow our own food. We will not be at the mercy of suppliers who charge us for rotten vegetables. What do you need?" For the first time since she arrived, someone looked at her not as a fragile duchess or a dying inconvenience, but as a person with a sensible idea. Silas's weathered face broke into a slow, wide grin. "Need? Just a couple of strong backs, and your leave to get started, miss. And maybe a new spade. Mine's about rusted through." Elara gave him that leave. She reallocated the wages from a phantom footman to hire 2 strong lads from the village to help Silas clear the garden. She herself, to the scandalized horror of Mrs. Croft, donned a pair of old gloves she found and spent hours in the walled garden, pulling weeds, her hands in the dirt. The physical labor was exhausting, but grounding. It rooted her to this place, not as its prisoner, but as its cultivator. Each weed she pulled was a small victory against the decay. She was equally ruthless with the contents of the house. The boarded-up wings were filled with treasures rotting under layers of dust and damp. Gilt furniture with the silk peeling off, priceless porcelain cracked and stained, paintings by masters obscured by mildew. She had Silas and his lads haul it all into the great hall. She sorted it with a cold, practical eye. What was too far gone was broken up for firewood. What was salvageable, she had cleaned. And what was valuable, but useless, silver dinner services for 100, jewel-encrusted snuff boxes, entire bolts of rotting silk brocade, she had catalogued. One day, she rode the single, sway-back mare from the stables into the local village, a place that had not seen a Duchess of Blackwood in 50 years. She found a merchant, a shrewd man with calculating eyes, and she made him a deal. She sold him a dozen silver platters, not for cash, but for a wagon-load of shingles, 3 barrels of lime for mortar, 10 sacks of flour, and 2 healthy pigs. Mrs. Croft was apoplectic. "You are selling the family silver. For shingles. I am trading useless metal for a roof that does not leak," Elara countered, her hands on her hips, her face smudged with dirt from the garden. "We cannot eat the silver, Mrs. Croft. We cannot shelter from the rain under it. We will have a warm kitchen and a full larder. That is my priority." Slowly, miraculously, the house began to change. It was a transformation born not of wealth, but of sheer, bloody-minded will. Silas and his lads, their loyalty now firmly with the strange, practical Duchess, repaired the roof over the kitchens and the central block. The scent of baking bread began to replace the smell of mildew. The kitchen garden, cleared and planted, began to show neat rows of green shoots. The pigs installed in a repaired sty grunted contentedly. Alara had found a store of old herbals in the library and began cultivating rosemary, thyme, and sage, their hardy scents a fragrant rebellion against the damp. She had consolidated her world into a small, functional fortress. The great, echoing tomb of Blackwood had shrunk. Now it was a warm kitchen, a dry bedroom, a library filled with useful books, and a garden promising a harvest. The staff, what was left of them, no longer looked at her with contempt or pity. They looked at her with a grudging, growing respect. She was not the fragile Duchess they had been expecting. She was the woman who had brought the heart of the house back to life with nothing but common sense and a will of iron. She rarely thought of the Duke. He was a ghost, a distant memory associated with a cold room and a colder pronouncement. This was her world now. She had built it from the ruins he had left her in. She had found her footing on a foundation of mud and stone and made it solid. One crisp autumn afternoon, months after her arrival, she was at the great desk in the library. It had been his father's desk, a massive piece of mahogany that she had claimed as her command center. It was covered not with polite correspondence, but with her ledgers, with plans for the winter, with lists of necessary repairs and diagrams of crop rotation she had copied from a book. Her hands were stained with ink, a smudge of dirt was on her cheek, and her hair, once impeccably styled, was escaping its pins. She was tallying the first harvest from the garden, a respectable pile of potatoes, carrots, and hardy greens, when she heard it. The sound of carriage wheels on the gravel of the drive. Not the slow rumble of a merchant cart, but the fast, rhythmic crunch of a fine, well-sprung coach. Silas appeared at the library door, his old face etched with alarm. "Your Grace," he said, his voice low, "it's the ducal carriage. He's back." Alara's heart, which had been beating with a steady, pragmatic rhythm for months, gave a sudden, violent lurch. A cold dread, a feeling she had almost forgotten, washed over her. She looked down at her ink-stained fingers, at the practical, worn dress she wore. She was not the Duchess he had married. She was someone else entirely. She had forgotten how to be fragile. She had forgotten how to be quiet. She stood up, her spine straight, and walked to the window. The black carriage, gleaming and immaculate, stood before her repaired front door. The ducal crest seemed to mock the humble, hard-working reality of the world she had built. The door to the carriage opened. Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, stepped out. He looked different, thinner, more tired. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and the exhaustion that clung to him was no longer a matter of mere ennui, but a profound, bone-deep weariness. His gaze went first to the gate, which now hung straight and true on new iron hinges, then to the driveway, which was clear of weeds and neatly raked. His eyes lifted to the roofline, where he saw not gaping holes but neat rows of new shingles, and then to the chimneys, from which several columns of healthy, white smoke now rose into the crisp autumn air. He stood there for a long moment, his face a mask of disbelief. He had returned to his family's tomb, seeking the silence of the grave after the clamor of politics and the lingering echoes of war. He had expected to find it further along in its decay, one step closer to being swallowed by the earth. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, to find a fresh headstone in the family plot. He did not expect this. He did not expect signs of life. He turned his head and saw a figure standing at the library window. A woman. For a moment, he did not recognize her. The woman he had married was a pale, wraith-like creature, all sharp angles and fragile health. This woman, even seen from a distance, stood with a straight-back confidence that was utterly unfamiliar. He strode to the front door and pushed it open. not waiting for a servant. The great hall, which he remembered as a cold, dusty cavern, was clean. The air smelled not of mildew, but of beeswax and wood smoke. The chill was gone, replaced by a steady, radiant warmth. He walked through the house, his boots echoing on the polished floors. He was an intruder, a ghost in a place that had learned to live without him. He followed the low murmur of voices toward the library. He stopped in the doorway, and there she was. She was standing behind the massive desk, his desk, which was covered in papers and ledgers. She was not pale. A healthy color bloomed in her cheeks, from the sun or from defiance, he could not tell. Her eyes, which he remembered as merely lucid, were now sharp, intelligent, and utterly unyielding. There was ink on her fingers and a smudge of what looked like dirt on her cheek. Her simple dress was practical, not fashionable, but on her it looked like armor. She was not magnificent in the way of the painted dolls in London's ballrooms. She was magnificent in the way of a fortress that has withstood a siege. He stared at her, the words he had prepared, polite, dismissive inquiries about her health, dying in his throat. All he could manage, the only thought that could surface through his shock, came out as a blunt, accusatory statement. "You're alive." Alara looked at the man standing in the doorway of her library. Her library. He looked like a wraith, haunted and worn thin by the world outside these walls. His immaculate black coat was an intrusion of a life she no longer knew. She met his shocked, winter sky eyes without flinching. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage, but her voice, when she spoke, was perfectly even, laced with a cool, biting irony that she had honed in her solitary reign. "I apologize for the inconvenience." Alistair felt the words like a physical slap. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it stunned him into silence. He had expected tears, or fear, or at the very least a subservient curtsy from the sickly creature he had abandoned. He had not expected a queen defending her throne, armed with wit as sharp as a blade. He took a step into the room, his eyes sweeping over the desk, the neat stacks of papers, the open ledger with its columns of orderly figures. This was not the chamber of a dying invalid. This was a command center. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice rough. He gestured vaguely at the desk, at the entire room, which felt alien to him. It was his library, but it smelled of dried herbs and old paper and a faint, clean scent of soap. "This," Alara replied, her chin held high, "is what running an estate looks like. Or have you been away, so long you've forgotten?" She did not move from behind the desk. It was her bastion, her wall of oak and mahogany, and she would not surrender it. His jaw tightened. The exhaustion of his journey, the weeks of political maneuvering in London, the constant, grinding weight of his ducal responsibilities, it all coalesced into a cold, simmering anger. He was the Duke of Blackwood. This was his house, his desk, and this woman, this penniless orphan he had plucked from obscurity, was speaking to him as if he were a stable boy who had tracked mud on her clean floor. "I'm the master of this house," he stated, his voice low and dangerous. It was a tone that made ministers in Parliament fall silent. It had no such effect on Alara. "You are the owner of this house, Your Grace," she corrected him, her tone precise. "Its master has been absent. A house, like a ship, requires a captain at the helm. This one was sinking. I merely plugged the leaks. By selling the family's silver?" He shot back, the report from a panicked agent in the local village suddenly making a new, infuriating kind of sense. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, a chilling, humorless expression. "By trading useless, heavy metal for a roof that keeps the rain off our heads and flour that bakes into bread. A concept of practical economics that appears to be as foreign to the Blackwood ledgers as the concept of a solvent estate." He stalked further into the room, his presence a dark, brooding storm. He stopped just before the desk, looming over her. He had a good foot of height on her, and his shoulders were twice as broad. He was used to intimidating people with his sheer physical presence. He was used to them cowering. Alara simply looked up at him, her gaze unwavering, and for the first time, he noticed the color of her eyes. He had registered them as lucid before, But now he saw they were the color of moss in deep woods, a vibrant, intelligent green. "You overstep yourself, madam. I have been keeping myself and this household alive," she retorted, her voice dropping to a fierce, intense whisper. "While you were in London, this house was on the brink of collapse. The staff were ghosts on the payroll, the larders were empty, and the rain was coming in through the roof of the Great Hall. I was given a choice. I could lie down in the damp and die quietly, as I believe was the unspoken expectation, or I could fight. I chose to fight. Do not dare come back here, to this place I have held together with my own 2 hands, and lecture me about overstepping." Her passion was a furnace blast in the quiet room. It was so unexpected, so utterly at odds with the fragile, coughing girl he had married, that he was momentarily speechless. He saw her then, truly saw her. The strength in the slender line of her jaw, the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the capability in her ink-stained hands. He had purchased a delicate, dying bird to place in a cage, and returned to find an eagle had taken up residence instead. Just then, Mrs. Croft appeared at the door, her face a mixture of anxiety and her usual sourness. She curtsied deeply, her deference to him a stark contrast to the defiance of the woman behind the desk. "Your Grace, I was not aware you were expected. Shall I have your rooms prepared?" "My rooms are always to be prepared," Alistair snapped, his anger finding an easier target. "Of course, Your Grace. It is just the West Wing has been closed for the season, to conserve fuel." Alistair's head whipped back toward Alara. "You closed my wing." "I closed all wings that were not essential for survival," Alara said calmly. "Your own included. It seemed an unnecessary expense. Given that you were not here, the dry, situational irony was not lost on her. The Duke, unable to access his own chambers. "And where, precisely, did you expect me to sleep? In a barn?" he demanded, his voice dripping with scorn. "I did not expect you at all," she replied, her honesty as blunt as a hammer. "However, the king's chamber is aired and ready. I keep it prepared for unexpected guests." The implication was clear. He was now a guest in his own home. The power struggle was no longer subtext. It was the entire conversation. He was the Duke, the owner, the man with the title and the power in the world outside. But here, within these stone walls she had reclaimed, his authority was meaningless. The staff's loyalty, he was beginning to realize, was no longer his by default. Mrs. Croft looked from him to Alara, her expression conflicted. The old order versus the new. The absent landlord versus the present, practical mistress. "Prepare my rooms in the West Wing," Alistair commanded the housekeeper, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Now." Mrs. Croft scurried away, and the tense silence returned to the library. Alistair paced the room like a caged wolf, his energy too large and violent for the ordered space she had created. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound frustration. He had come here for peace, for the dead, silent quiet of a place that demanded nothing of him. Instead, he had walked into a war on a new front, and the enemy was his own wife. "I came here for solitude," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Not for this bustling domesticity. This bustling domesticity is called solvency, Your Grace," Alara said, beginning to gather her ledgers, a clear dismissal. "Solitude is a luxury. Survival is a necessity. I have been attending to the latter." He stopped his pacing and stared at her. The sheer force of her will was a tangible thing. She had not just survived, she had triumphed. She had taken the ruin he had condemned her to and had forged it into a kingdom. Her kingdom. And he, the rightful king, was now an interloper. A grudging respect, cold and unwelcome, began to seed itself in the barren ground of his soul. He had chosen her for her perceived weakness, and it was her strength that now confronted him. "Leave the books," he said. It was an order, but it lacked the sharp edge of his earlier commands. Alara paused, her hands on the heavy ledgers. "They are my work, and this is my desk," he countered. He walked around the desk and sat in the chair, his chair. It was an act of reclamation, a deliberate move to reassert his dominance. He looked at her across the expanse of polished wood. "Tell me what you have done." It was not a request. It was a demand for a report. But it was also, he realized with a jolt, the first time he had asked her for anything other than her signature on a contract. Alara saw the subtle shift. He was not commending her. He was not thanking her. He was assessing her, like a general assessing a subordinate's unexpected tactical victory. But he was, at least, acknowledging that a victory had occurred. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly, she sat in the smaller chair opposite the desk, the one usually reserved for supplicants. The irony of the reversed roles was palpable. For the next hour, as the autumn light faded outside the window, she explained. She spoke of the leaking roofs and the phantom staff. She spoke of the rotted food stores and the unheated rooms. She spoke of selling the silver for shingles, of turning the wilderness of the garden into a productive plot, of boarding up the decaying wings to conserve the heart of the house. She spoke in a calm, factual tone, her narrative punctuated by the neat columns of figures in her ledgers, which she pushed across the desk for his inspection. She did not speak of her illness, of her despair, of the cold, or of the profound loneliness. She reported only the facts of her campaign. Alistair listened in silence, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth. He scanned the ledgers, his eye for detail as sharp as hers. He saw the ruthless practicality of her decisions. He saw the logic. He saw the sheer, impossible scale of what she had accomplished. She had saved his ancestral home from ruin with nothing but a housemaid's budget and an iron will. He had left a duchess to die, and a master strategist had risen in her place. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. The only sound was the crackle of the fire she had lit hours ago. He looked up from the books, his gaze meeting hers across the desk. The emptiness in his eyes was still there, but it was joined now by something else, something complex and unsettling. It might have been respect. It might have been resentment. "You have been busy," he said, the cynical understatement a testament to his shock. "I have been surviving," she corrected him softly. "There is a difference." The truce, if it could be called that, was a fragile and unspoken thing. Alistair did not leave. He stayed, a restless, brooding presence in the house she had tamed. He was a king in exile in his own kingdom. He took up residence in his restored West Wing, a part of the house that still felt like his, but the heart of the home, the kitchens, the library, the warm central rooms, remained her territory. They lived in the same house, but in different worlds, circling each other like two wary predators who have not yet decided whether to fight or to ignore one another. He watched her. He saw her in the mornings, consulting with Silas in the garden, her hair tied back, a smudge of dirt on her nose. He saw her in the afternoons, poring over her ledgers in the library, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw her in the evenings, ensuring the fires were banked and the house was secure for the night. She moved with a purpose and an authority that was absolute. The staff, from Mrs. Croft down to the newest stable boy, answered to her without question. Her word was law. He did not interfere. He told himself it was because her practical solutions were, for the moment, effective. The estate was, for the first time in his lifetime, not a drain on his coffers. But there was another reason, one he would not admit even to himself. He was fascinated. He had spent his life surrounded by two kinds of women: the grasping, ambitious schemers of the aristocracy and the pliant, disposable women he sought for fleeting comfort. Alara was neither. She was a category of one. She wanted nothing from him, not his title, not his money, not his affection. She had built her own world and seemed perfectly content to live in it without him. His presence was an inconvenience she tolerated, nothing more. For her part, Alara was acutely aware of him. He was a storm cloud on the horizon of her well-ordered world. His silent, watchful presence unnerved her. She felt his eyes on her as she worked, as she fortified her defenses, making her voice sharper, her posture more rigid. She would not let him see any crack in the armor she had so carefully constructed. She had fought too hard for her independence to cede an inch of it now. Their interactions were brief, formal, and charged with unspoken tension. They took their meals separately, he in the cavernous dining hall, she at the simple table in her small parlor. They passed in the corridors with a stiff nod. The only time they spoke was when the running of the estate required it. The roof over the stables needs repair before the first snow, she would inform him, her tone that of a steward reporting to a landlord. See to it, he would reply, his voice flat. He would approve the expenditure from his London accounts, the only part of the finances she could not control, and the work would be done. They were colleagues in a strange, unwanted partnership. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The last of the autumn leaves fell, leaving the skeletal trees stark against a sky the color of slate. The wind that swept down from the moors had a new, biting edge to it. A sense of foreboding began to settle over the house, the quiet before a storm. The storm broke on a Tuesday night. It arrived without warning, a furious squall that threw itself against the house with a primal, violent rage. Rain came down in solid sheets, and the wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the window frames and moaning in the chimneys. It was a storm of biblical proportions, the kind of wild, elemental fury that reminded one of how fragile civilization truly was. Alara was in her parlor, mending a tear in a linen sheet by the light of a single lamp. The rhythmic, domestic act was a comfort against the chaos raging outside. The house, her fortress, was holding strong. The roof was not leaking. The fires were drawing well. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Suddenly, a deafening crack of thunder shook the house to its very foundations. It was not a distant rumble, but a sharp, explosive sound, as if a cannon had been fired directly outside the window. The lamp flickered, and the room was plunged into momentary darkness before the flame steadied itself. From the west wing, a crash echoed through the house, the sound of shattering glass. Alara froze, her needle poised in midair. Another crash followed, this one louder, accompanied by a hoarse, guttural cry that was not human. It was the sound of pure, animalistic terror. It was coming from his rooms. For a moment, she did nothing. He was not her concern. He was the Duke. He was the man who had abandoned her. But the sound came again, a choked, desperate yell, and something in her broke. It was not a sound of anger or authority. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart. Leaving the sheet on the chair, she grabbed the lamp and hurried out of her parlor. The corridor was dark and cold. The wind howled, and with every fresh peal of thunder, the house seemed to tremble. She ran toward the west wing, the lamp casting huge, dancing shadows on the walls. The door to his study was ajar. The sound was coming from within. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside, and the scene before her stopped her breath. The room was in shambles. A chair was overturned. A decanter and glasses lay shattered on the floor, the dark stain of brandy spreading across the priceless rug. The heavy velvet curtains had been torn from their moorings, and the window beyond them was a gaping, jagged hole, the wind and rain pouring into the room. And in the center of it all was Alistair. He was not a duke. He was not the cold, detached master of the house. He was crouched in the corner of the room, his back pressed against the wall, his hands covering his head. His big frame was racked with violent tremors. He was muttering to himself, his voice a raw, broken litany of names and places she did not recognize. Sousa, fire, the guns, God, the guns incoming. The haunted look she had seen in his eyes was no longer a subtle shadow. It had consumed him. His face was pale, slick with sweat, his eyes wide and unfocused, staring at horrors only he could see. The thunder, she realized. The sharp, explosive crack of the thunder had not just been a sound to him. It had been the sound of cannon fire. The storm was not just a storm. It was a battlefield. The war he had left behind had followed him home. Alara stood frozen in the doorway, the lamp shaking in her hand. Her first instinct was to retreat, to flee from this terrifying, raw display of a man utterly broken. This was a private hell, and she was an intruder. But as another tremor shook his body and a low, agonized moan escaped his lips, her pragmatism took over. This was not a duke in need of deference. This was a human being in crisis. In a crisis, like a leaking roof or an empty larder, was a problem to be solved. She set the lamp down on a table, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked over to the shattered window, the wind and rain lashing at her face and dress. She ignored the cold. With methodical strength, she dragged the heavy, overturned armchair and wedged it against the ruined curtains, creating a makeshift barrier to block the worst of the storm's fury. The noise in the room subsided slightly. Then she approached him. She moved slowly, as one would approach a terrified, wounded animal. She knelt on the floor a few feet away from him, careful not to enter his personal space. He did not seem to see her. His eyes were still fixed on the ghosts of his past. "Alistair," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She had never used his given name before. It felt strange and momentous on her tongue. He flinched, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Get down. They have the range." He was not there. He was in Spain or Portugal or wherever it was he had seen the things that had hollowed him out. Pity was useless. Logic was useless. She needed to ground him, to pull him back from the edge of that bloody precipice. "Alistair," she said again, her voice a little louder, cutting through his litany. "The battle is over. You are at Blackwood. You are in Northumberland. It is only a storm." She reached out, slowly, and touched his arm. His muscles were corded with tension, his whole body vibrating like a plucked string. At her touch, he recoiled as if burned, his head snapping up, his eyes finally focusing on her. For a second, he looked at her with the wild, terrified gaze of a man looking at the enemy. "Who?" he rasped. "It's Alara," she said, keeping her voice steady, anchoring. "Your wife. You are home. You are safe." She did not remove her hand. She kept it there, a small point of firm, steady pressure on his arm. His breathing was harsh and ragged, each inhale a desperate gasp. She could feel the violent tremors that continued to rack his frame. She did not speak again. She just knelt there, in the wreckage of his study, in the heart of the storm, her hand on his arm, a silent, unwavering presence. Slowly, glacially, the wild terror in his eyes began to recede. The focus shifted. He was no longer seeing cannon smoke and dying men. He was seeing the floorboards. He was seeing the shattered glass. He was seeing her. His gaze dropped to her hand on his arm, then traveled up to her face. He saw her rain-soaked dress, her determined expression, the complete absence of fear or pity in her eyes. She was not recoiling from his madness. She was meeting it, a small, solid rock in the midst of his internal tempest. The tremors began to subside. His breathing, while still ragged, deepened. He seemed to collapse in on himself, the rigid terror replaced by a profound, boneless exhaustion. He leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. The fight had gone out of him, leaving only the wreckage. "The thunder," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. It sounded like the guns at Badajoz. It was a confession, a crack in the marble facade. He had named his demon. Alara did not say, "I know," or "It's all right." The platitudes would have been an insult. Instead, she gave him the only thing she had to offer, a practical truth. "The storm is passing," she said softly. "The worst of it is over." She stayed with him, kneeling on the cold floor, until the last of the tremors had ceased and his breathing had evened out into the slow, deep rhythm of a man utterly spent. She did not speak. The silence in the room was no longer charged with tension or anger. It was a new kind of silence. It was the quiet of an aftermath, heavy and raw, but peaceful. When he finally stirred, he did not pull away. He simply opened his eyes and looked at her, and the vast, empty distance was gone. For the first time, he was truly present. He saw her not as an asset, not as a problem, not as a surprising strategist, but as the woman who had knelt in the dark and held him together when his world had shattered. He started, his voice cracking. He could not finish. The words would not come. "Don't," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. She removed her hand from his arm and slowly got to her feet. Her own body ached from the cold and the awkward position. "Culme, you cannot stay here." She expected him to resist, to retreat back into his ducal pride. But he did not. He allowed her to help him to his feet. He was unsteady, leaning on her slightly, and she was struck by the sheer weight and size of him and by his current, shocking vulnerability. The haunted Duke, the ruthless commander, was leaning on her for support, and she, the fragile, sickly girl, was strong enough to bear it. She did not lead him to his grand, cold bedroom. She led him out of the west wing, through the quiet, sleeping house, and into her own territory. She took him to her small, warm parlor. The fire she had left was still burning brightly, casting a welcoming, golden glow over the room. The mending she had been working on lay on the chair, a symbol of the peaceful, ordered world he had just shattered. She settled him into the one comfortable armchair by the fire and wrapped an old woolen blanket around his shoulders. He sank into it, his eyes closing, a man seeking refuge. He did not speak. He did not have to. His surrender was absolute. Alara left him there and went to the kitchen. The fire in the range was banked, but still warm. She added a few small logs, and using the ever-hot water from the boiler, she made a pot of tea. Not the delicate, fashionable tea of London drawing rooms, but strong, black tea, laced with a generous dollop of honey from their own hives and a splash of brandy from a bottle she kept for medicinal purposes. It was a practical, restorative brew. She also toasted a thick slice of the bread she had baked 2 days prior, spreading it with butter. When she returned to the parlor, he had not moved. He was sitting exactly as she had left him, a dark, motionless shape in the armchair, staring into the flames. She placed a tray on a small table beside him. "Drink this," she said. It was an order, but a quiet one. "And eat." He looked at the steam rising from the cup, at the simple slice of bread and butter. It was the food of a nursery, of a sickroom. It was an offering of pure, unadorned care. He picked up the cup, his hands still not entirely steady, and drank. The hot, sweet, strong liquid was a shock to his system. It was warmth and life. It was grounding. He ate the bread, not because he was hungry, but because she had given it to him. Alara sat in the other chair, opposite the fire, and picked up her mending. She did not watch him. She gave him the dignity of not being observed in his weakness. She simply sat, her needle moving in and out of the linen with a steady, rhythmic motion, her presence a quiet, unassuming anchor in the room. They sat that way for a long time, while the storm outside died down to a gentle, weeping rain. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the whisper of her needle through the cloth, and the quiet click of his cup being set back on the saucer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and raspy, directed at the fire. "No one has ever seen that. There is a great deal we have not seen in each other," Alara replied, her eyes still on her work. Her response was pragmatic, accepting. It was not pity. It was a statement of fact. Another long silence fell. He finished his tea. He did not touch the brandy decanter that sat on a sideboard a few feet away. "At Badajoz," he said, the words costing him an immense effort. The walls were breached. The slaughter, it went on for 3 days. It was not a battle. It was a descent into hell. Every time I hear a sound like that, like the cannons, he trailed off, unable to continue. He was giving her a piece of his brokenness, a shard of the trauma that defined him. He had never offered a piece of himself to anyone. He did not know why he was doing it now, only that in the warm, quiet space she had created, the confession felt possible. It felt necessary. Alara set her mending aside. She looked at him now, her gaze direct and clear. "My father was a gambler," she said, her voice quiet. "He was a kind man, a brilliant man, but he had a sickness, a fever for the cards. I spent my childhood watching him sell off our lives, piece by piece. A painting for one more hand, my mother's pearls for a night at the tables. By the end, there was nothing left but me. I know what it is to watch something you love be consumed by a sickness it cannot control." She was not equating their experiences. She was offering a piece of her own brokenness in return. It was a bridge built of shared damage, spanning the gulf between them. He had confessed his weakness, and she had responded not with horror or revulsion, but with a quiet admission of her own scars. Alistair looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the capable Castellan, past the defiant survivor. He saw the orphan girl who had been sold to him like a piece of furniture. He saw the source of the iron in her spine. There were two sides of the same coin, both forged in crucibles of loss and survival. He had thought himself utterly alone in his private hell. He now realized he was sitting across from a woman who had her own, and who had not only survived it, but had built a fortress on its ruins. The silence that followed was different again. It was no longer the quiet of an aftermath. It was the beginning of a shared silence, comfortable and solid. In the warm glow of the fire, in the heart of the house she had saved, a truce had finally, truly been called. He was not just a duke, and she was not just his inconvenient duchess. They were Alistair and Alara, and for the first time, they were in the same room. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic in the house shifted. The invisible walls between their territories began to dissolve. Alistair did not retreat back to the isolation of the West Wing. He started taking his breakfast, not in the lonely dining hall, but the great wooden table in the kitchen, where Alara presided over the start of the day. He would sit in silence, nursing a mug of tea, and listen as she gave her orders to the staff, a quiet, efficient whirlwind of practicality. He watched her discuss the winter stores with the cook, the mending of a fence with Silas, the need for more beeswax for candles with Mrs. Croft. He saw the intricate, thriving ecosystem she had built, and he did not interfere. He simply observed, a student of her quiet competence. One morning, she was going over the stable accounts at the kitchen table, a frown of concentration on her face. "The cost of oats is criminal," she muttered to herself. "And the hay we bought last month is half chaff. The fields to the south, the ones that lie fallow," Alistair said from his corner, his voice making her jump. She had almost forgotten he was there. "My grandfather used to grow hay there. The soil is loam over clay. It holds the water, but drains well. It's perfect for it." Alara looked up, surprised. "You know about such things?" "I grew up here," he said simply. Before everything. I spent more time with the groundsmen than I did with my tutors." A flicker of a memory of a boy he had long since buried crossed his face. A new avenue opened between them. He knew the land. He knew its history, its secrets, its moods. She knew how to make it work, how to turn its potential into a harvest. The next day, she unrolled a map of the estate on the library desk. It was old and cracked, the ink faded. "Show me," she said. And so their partnership began. It was a partnership of the soil, of practicality, of shared purpose. He would walk the land with her, his long strides easily keeping pace with her determined ones. He pointed out the old drainage ditches that Silas could clear, the stand of woods that was best for coppicing for firewood, the quarry where they could get stone for repairing the walls of the kitchen garden. She listened, absorbed his knowledge, and translated it into her ledgers and work plans. They worked together. They spent a day with Silas and the two farmhands mucking out the long-neglected dairy. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his ducal hands grimed with dirt, shoveled decades of old straw and muck alongside the others. Alara, her dress protected by a heavy apron, scraped the walls clean and directed the application of a fresh coat of lime wash. There was a moment when she stumbled on the uneven floor, and he reached out a hand to steady her. His grip on her arm was firm, grounding. It was not a romantic touch, but it was a touch of connection, of shared physical effort. When she was steady, he let go, but the feeling of his calloused hand on her arm lingered. They discovered a strange, complementary rhythm. He possessed the long-forgotten knowledge of the estate's past, and she had the sharp, pragmatic vision for its future. He remembered the theory. She mastered the practice. The silence between them, as they worked, was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a comfortable space, filled with the unspoken understanding of their common goal. One afternoon, he found her in the library, staring at a pile of ledgers with a look of utter despair. "What is it?" he asked, his voice softer than she was used to. "The taxes," she said, gesturing to the papers with a frustrated hand. "And the tithes." and the leases on the tenant farms. It's a disaster. Some tenants haven't paid in years. Others are paying based on contracts that are a century out of date. The entire financial structure is rotten to the core. I can save pennies on candles and bread, but this is a flood that will sink us no matter how much I bail. She looked up at him, her armor finally cracking, her frustration and exhaustion clear in her eyes. The accounts are a mess. I don't know how to fix this. It was a confession of failure, the first she had ever made to him. She was admitting she had reached the limit of her abilities. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not take over. He pulled up a chair beside her at the desk. "Let me see," he said. For the rest of the day and long into the night, they worked side by side. He brought his knowledge of the law, of contracts, of the complex web of obligations and entitlements that came with his title. He understood the arcane language of the leases, the political realities behind the tax codes. She brought her meticulous attention to detail and her fierce, uncompromising sense of fairness. She saw the human cost behind the numbers, the families struggling on the tenant farms. "We can't simply evict them," she argued, pointing to the name of a family that was years in arrears. "Their farm is flooded twice in the last 5 years. The river embankment needs to be repaired. Repairing it would cost more than the farm is worth in 20 years of rent," he countered, his voice the pragmatic voice of the landlord. "Then we don't treat it as rent," she shot back. "We treat it as an investment. A functioning farm pays its dues and employs people. A derelict one is just more rot. We lease them the land for a peppercorn for 5 years on the condition that they provide the labor to help Silas repair the embankment. We provide the materials. It is better than nothing, and it builds loyalty." He looked at her, at the fierce passion in her eyes, and he saw not a bleeding heart, but a brilliant strategist. She understood that loyalty was an asset more valuable than gold. She was not just managing an estate. She was building a community, a fiefdom that was loyal to her, its protector. He nodded slowly. "Draft the agreement." They became a team. He was the Minister of External Affairs, handling the law and the world beyond Blackwood's gates. She was the Minister of the Interior, the undisputed ruler of everything within them. They would spend their evenings in the library, the great desk, now a shared workspace, 2 lamps burning late into the night, their heads bent over maps and ledgers. The house was their shared project, their joint enterprise. The first snow fell, blanketing the land in a pristine, silent white. The house was ready. The larder was full. The firewood was stacked high. The roofs were sound. Blackwood was no longer a tomb. It was a fortress braced against the coming winter, and they were its joint commanders. The intimacy that grew between them was not one of whispered sweet nothings or stolen kisses. It was the intimacy of shared labor, of mutual respect, of 2 deeply scarred and solitary people finding an unexpected anchor in one another. It was in the way he started leaving a cup of tea on the desk for her when she was working late. It was in the way she started saving him the last slice of the seed cake he had, in a rare moment of unguardedness, admitted he liked. It was in the comfortable silences that stretched between them, no longer empty, but full of everything they did not need to say. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the library, the ledgers for once put away, he looked at her. She was reading a book, her face softened by the firelight, her expression calm and content. The fragile, coughing girl was gone. So completely erased, it was as if she had never existed. In her place was this strong, capable, incredible woman who had faced down his ghosts and had rebuilt his world. A feeling he could not name, a feeling he had thought himself incapable of, rose in his chest. It was warm and vast and terrifying. It was more frightening than any battlefield, because it was a territory for which he had no maps. He had married her as a matter of cold, ducal duty. He had abandoned her to die. And somewhere along the way, in the mud and the rain and the ink and the ashes, he had fallen in love with his wife. The winter settled in, deep and quiet. The world outside Blackwood's gates seemed to cease to exist. Their fortress held. The days fell into a comfortable, productive rhythm. Alistair found a strange peace in the practicality of his new life. The ghosts of the war still visited him on the darkest nights, but they were quieter now, their voices muffled by the steady, grounding presence of the house and the woman who was its heart. He was no longer just the Duke of Blackwood, a title that felt like a suit of armor he could never remove. He was Alistair, the man who knew how to mend a dry stone wall and could predict the weather by the feel of the air. He was becoming a part of his own home. Alara, too, had found a sense of peace she had never known. The constant, gnawing anxiety of her former life had been replaced by the satisfying certainties of the seasons, of the harvest, of a roof that did not leak. She had a home, she had a purpose, and she had him, this complicated, broken, and surprisingly capable man who had become her unexpected partner. She still kept her guard up, a habit learned over a lifetime of disappointments, but the walls were lower now. She found herself watching him, noticing the way a rare, genuine smile transformed his severe features, the quiet intelligence in his eyes when he solved a problem, the surprising gentleness in his large, scarred hands when he handled a new seedling. The call of the old world, when it came, was an intrusion, a harsh, discordant note in the quiet harmony they had built. It arrived on the back of a half-frozen horse, in the form of a royal courier, his coat emblazoned with the king's crest. He carried an urgent dispatch from London, sealed with the imposing wax of a minister's office. They were in the library when Silas announced the courier's arrival. The man was brought in, stamping his feet to bring life back to them, his breath pluming in the cold air of the great hall. He handed the leather pouch to Alistair with a bow, his eyes wide with curiosity at the sight of the Duke of Blackwood in worn country clothes, looking more like a gentleman farmer than a peer of the realm. Alistair took the pouch, his expression hardening as his fingers closed around it. The feel of it was familiar, the weight of it a heavy, unwelcome memory. It was the feel of duty, of politics, of the life he had tried to leave behind. He brought it back into the library, where Alara was waiting, her book forgotten in her lap. She saw the change in him immediately. The relaxed lines of his face had tightened, the familiar mask of the cold, detached Duke sliding back into place. He was no longer Alistair, her partner. He was Blackwood, a man with obligations that had nothing to do with this house, with her. Her own defenses slammed back into place, a cold, familiar dread icing her veins. Of course, this quiet interlude was just that, an interlude, a pause between acts. He was a duke. His life was not here in the mud and the ledgers. His life was out there, in the world of power and consequence. She had been a fool to think otherwise, a fool to allow the walls around her heart to crumble. "It will be London, I expect," she said, her voice cool and formal, the voice of the steward she had once been. A command from the king, perhaps. The political situation is unstable. She was preparing herself, rebuilding her fortress against the inevitable abandonment. He would leave. Of course he would leave. This was just a rustic holiday for him, a place to heal before returning to his real life. He did not answer. He stood by the fire, his back to her, and broke the seal. He unrolled the parchment and read, his face grim. The silence stretched, thick with her unspoken fears and his unreadable thoughts. She stood up, smoothing her dress. "I shall have Mrs. Croft pack your things. The roads will be difficult, but with fresh horses." "No," he said, his voice quiet. Alara stopped. "No." He turned from the fire to face her. His expression was one she had never seen before. It was not the haunted look of the soldier, nor the cold mask of the Duke. It was the face of a man making a decision that would define the rest of his life. "They want me back," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "There is a crisis in the cabinet. They need my influence, my votes in the Lords. They write of duty, of obligation to the crown." "It is your duty," she said, her voice brittle. She was throwing his own past self back at him, protecting herself with the very logic he had once embodied. "You are the Duke of Blackwood." "I am," he agreed, his voice low and intense. "But I have been mistaken about where my duty lies. For years, I believed it was to a crown, to a title, to a collection of politicians in a smoke-filled room. I believed my purpose was in the world of men and their endless, bloody games. He took a step toward her, the parchment still clutched in his hand. My father, my grandfather, they built this title. They bled for it, but they let this place, the heart of it all, rot. They served the idea of Blackwood, but they abandoned the reality of it. I did the same. I came back here seeking a grave, a final, quiet resting place from a life that had exhausted me. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat from the fire on his clothes. And I found you. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were no longer cold. They were blazing with a fierce, terrifying intensity. You did not serve an idea. You served the reality. You fought the damp and the decay. You put your hands in the dirt. You brought this house back from the dead. You showed me what duty really is. It is not to a distant king. It is to the land under your feet. It is to the people who depend on you. It is to the roof over your head. He lifted the hand that held the dispatch. And then, in a single symbolic act of defiance, he tossed the parchment into the fire. They watched together as the king's summons, the call of the old world, curled, blackened, and was consumed by the flames, turning to ash in the heart of their home. My duty is here, he said, his voice raw with emotion. He reached out and took her hands, his large, warm palms enveloping her cold fingers. My home is here. He looked down at her, his gaze holding hers, leaving her nowhere to hide. You are my home, Elara. The words, so simple, so direct, shattered the last of her defenses. All the walls she had so carefully built, all the cynical armor she had worn for a lifetime, crumbled to dust. He was not leaving. He was choosing this. He was choosing her. A sob, a sound of profound, heart-wrenching relief, escaped her lips, and the tears she had refused to shed for so long finally fell. He gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She leaned into him, burying her face in the rough wool of his coat, her tears soaking the fabric. She was not just the pragmatic survivor anymore. She was not the defiant Castellan. In his arms, she was simply Elara, a woman who had been alone for so long and had finally, miraculously, found a place to belong. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, murmuring her name like a prayer. He was not the haunted Duke. He was Alistair, a man who had been lost and had finally, impossibly, found his way home. The story did not end there. It began. Outside, the snow fell, blanketing the world in a deep and silent peace. But inside the walls of Blackwood, by the warmth of the fire, two scarred and solitary souls stood holding each other, no longer two separate entities, but a single, permanent fixture against the coming winter. The house around them, saved from ruin by their shared will, was no longer a tomb or even a fortress. It was fiercely, vibrantly alive, and for the first time in centuries, it was completely and utterly whole.